Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to give an overarching lecture for the final module, which is on Pakistan's economy. Now, there are three issues or three questions interrelated but distinct, which we will try to address in the context of Pakistan's development challenges. The first is the issue of the sustainability of growth. Why is it that Pakistan has not been able to sustain its GDP growth? The second is that if indeed there are structural constraints to achieving sustained growth, what is the nature of those structural constraints? And third, what kind of policy framework can we adopt such that we get out of the persistent pattern of a stop-go growth? We have periods of high growth followed by periods of low growth, and so our failure to sustain growth is the issue. And the question is, what kind of policies can we adopt to get out of this problem? And secondly, how do we address the issue of persisting inequalities both at the interpersonal as well as at the interregional levels? In a sense, all three questions are interrelated, as we'll see during the lecture. And in presenting the policy solutions to these central problems in the Pakistan economy, we will be, in a sense, developing a new framework, not only of growth, but of development in general. Okay? Right, so let's start. As we learned during the course of this module, one of the important distinguishing features between developed and underdeveloped countries is that the developed countries are able to sustain their per capita income growth rates over long periods of time, and therefore they are able to achieve a substantial improvement in the material conditions of their life, while underdeveloped countries are unable to do so. Underdeveloped countries are unable to sustain their GDP growth rates or per capita income growth rates, and therefore no substantial increase, no dramatic increase can take place over the long run in the per capita incomes of these countries. And as a consequence, the governments remain cash strapped because their revenues are dependent on the per capita incomes of people. And because the governments remain cash strapped, they are unable to provide, they claim, the services and the infrastructure which characterize more developed countries. Okay, so now, if the distinguishing feature between developed and underdeveloped countries is that developed countries are able to sustain their growth rates and underdeveloped countries are unable to do so, this does not necessarily mean that underdeveloped countries don't grow. They do, but they grow in spurts. They have periods of relatively high per capita income growth rates, followed by periods of economic stagnation when they're close to zero or even negative per capita income growth rates. So that the gains made during the high growth period are largely lost during the period of stagnation or even negative per capita income growth rates. Let's have a look at Pakistan's growth history, as the next table shows. And you will discover just from looking at this table that Pakistan's growth pattern is in fact the typical pattern of an underdeveloped country. We are unable to sustain our per capita income growth rate because we have a stop-go pattern of growth. We have periods of high growth followed by periods of stagnation. So, for example, during the Ayub period, Ayub Yahya period between 1960 to 73, our GDP growth rate was on average, annual average was 6.26%, which is roughly just about 2.6% in terms of per capita income growth rate, which by historical standards was an impressive per capita income growth. But then this is followed by a period of slow growth Subsequently, between 73 and 78, the period of Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, which again was followed by the Ziaul Haq period, the decade 1978 to 88, when we had once again a high rate of GDP growth, 6.6%, which was followed once again by slow growth for the next decade. And then by the time Musharraf came into power in 1998, growth, actually by 2000 the growth accelerated. First 2 years were periods of slow growth for Musharraf, but by 2000 the growth began to pick up, and the Musharraf period 1998 to 2008 as a whole showed once again a relatively high GDP growth of 6.25%. This then again was followed by another period of rather slow growth, and in fact there were years when there was negative per capita income growth rate of 2.62 average between 2008 and 2011. So the high growth, low growth, high growth, low growth pattern of Pakistan's growth history, as I said, is typical of the underdeveloped countries, which, as we said, can grow only in spurts. The next graph actually gives you a picture, a graphical picture of the same data, and you can see in it visually that our growth rate is highly unstable. High growth, low growth, up and down. But interestingly, the long-term trend of GDP growth is a downward trend, right? Unlike China and India, which have an upward trend in the same period in terms of their GDP growth rate. Okay, so not only is our GDP growth rate highly unstable, but its long-term trend is that of a declining rate of GDP growth. Not a very healthy state of affairs to be in for a country that wants to improve the material conditions of its people. Okay, the next graph is an interesting one, because what it does is that it contrasts the pattern of GDP growth with the pattern of the current account, the deficit and the current account balance. You find that it's precisely during periods of high growth that the current account deficit becomes very high, and and during periods of low GDP growth, the current account deficit in fact declines. So in a sense, the blue graph, which is the current account deficit graph, is like a kind of mirror image of the graph for the GDP growth rate. Now this gives you a clue into approximate reason for why we have followed an up and down growth pattern. And that reason clearly is that during periods of high GDP growth, our import expenditures increase. Naturally, if you want to grow rapidly, you invest in machinery and spares, and you import more fuel and industrial raw materials, apart from consumer goods, as per capita incomes are rising. So your import expenditures tend to go up. And it appears that our export earnings historically have not grown at a rate such that during the high growth period, the export earnings can finance the high import expenditures that are associated with high growth. To repeat, it is during periods of high growth when import expenditures go up, and since our export earnings are inadequate to finance the import requirements of high growth, we hit into a balance of payments crisis, and that is how every high growth period has ended, with a balance of payment crisis. At the end of the Ayub government, there was a balance of payments crisis at the end of the 60s. At the end of the Ziaul Haq period, there was a balance of payments crisis, the period of high growth. At the end of the Musharraf period, there was a balance of payments crisis, again at the end of a period of high growth. So that, in a sense, gives you a clue that we can pursue in the latter part of the lecture. That the the proximate reason for an unstable GDP growth rate, our inability to sustain GDP growth, perhaps lies in the fact that our export growth is not high enough to be able to finance the import requirements of high growth. And the question that we'll raise near the end of the lecture is why is our export growth inadequate, and what can be done to solve the problem. Okay, now before we go into that, I think it's important to learn from the history of Pakistan's economic policy. And in a sense, the mold of Pakistan's economy, the structure of Pakistan's economy was set in the Ayub period, which was a period of relatively high growth, and where a particular policy framework, a particular economic strategy was clearly articulated and then implemented fairly effectively. The second and third 5-year plan periods. Just before the Ayub government began to undertake its economic strategy, Simon Kuznets produced his famous paper, which empirically showed the relationship between growth and inequality. And what he showed, as you can see in the next graph, or an inverted U graph, is that in a sense inequality is good for growth initially. That initially, as countries begin to grow, inequality grows. Then the inequality flattens out at later stages of growth. And finally, when the country has achieved high rates of growth, then inequality declines as far as Simon Kuznets is concerned. So basically, the implication of his empirical work was that inequality is good for growth in the initial stages, and you've got nothing to worry about inequality because market forces will come into play, the same market forces that have induced inequality in the beginning. Those market forces will in time reduce inequality as the growth process proceeds. Okay, now there is a kind of superficially commonsensical formulation underlying that, because the idea there is, the basic assumption, which is a dangerous assumption to make, is that only the rich are able to save and invest. And so the idea was that if you make the rich richer, your total savings and investment will increase, and therefore your growth rate will increase. That was, I think, the underlying implication, policy implication from the work of Simon Kuznets. In any event, that's the way Pakistani economists interpreted Simon Kuznets' work, right? Like now, we find it difficult to critically evaluate the received wisdom in economics, which is, one of the purposes of this course is to do a critical examination of Pakistan's economic policy. But anyway, this wasn't done at the beginning of the Ayub period. And so what happened was that the Simon Kuznets view was assiduously absorbed and included in the design of Pakistan's, or incorporated in the design of Pakistan's economic strategy. This strategy of the 1960s followed Dr. Mahbubul Haq famously called the doctrine of functional inequality. Dr. Haq, who was a highly influential economist and policymaker at that time, had preceded his governmental work with a famous book which was based on his PhD thesis, The Strategy of Economic Planning. And in that book, he articulates a proposition that became the basis of Pakistan's economic strategy, the strategy of functional inequality. He says there, and I've quoted it on the slide, quote, "There exists, therefore, a functional justification for inequality of income. He ends this by saying the road to eventual equalities may inevitably lie through initial inequities. So this faithfully embodies or incorporates the Simon Kuznets view, which I have just indicated to you. Okay. So Pakistan embarked on a policy of, in fact, shifting incomes from the poor to the rich, making the rich richer on the basis of the assumption that since it's only the rich who save and invest, as the rich become richer, they'll invest more and growth will accelerate. And it's only later that we can worry about inequality. So let inequality flourish in the beginning. A whole range of policies were adopted towards that end as instruments of achieving growth on the basis of inequality. These included nurturing an entrepreneurial, an industrial entrepreneurial class on the basis of giving them licenses to set up industry to selected favored individuals. And once you got a license to set up an industry, you got privileged access over credit. You were able to obtain low interest credit, subsidized credit. You were able to get protection of various types for import protection for the goods that you manufactured domestically. And this import protection could vary between placing very high import duties on competing imports to actually selectively placing quantitative controls over competing imports. The consequence was that this entrepreneurial elite, which was being nurtured within what we now understand to be an institutional framework that was based on generating and giving rents to the elites of the country, and so or unearned income for these elites. And so the industrial elite was able to get these rents, these unearned incomes, and they were not provided with the kind of competitive environment, international competitive environment, which would push them into increasing, which would create incentives for increasing efficiency, productivity, and bringing in innovations and becoming internationally competitive in terms of our exports. And so the consequence was that while growth did take place, many of these industries, in fact, the most important industry, the textile industry, was, according to the famous paper by J.J. Stern, producing negative value added. That is to say that if you measured its cost of production in terms of international prices, and you measured the value of its output in terms of international prices, then it was this industry, which was Pakistan's largest industry, was in fact so inefficient that it was producing negative value added. So now there were three features of the kind of industrial structure that emerged. The first was that these industries were concentrated in a few hands because only selected people were given these licenses, and they became rich fairly quickly. And they increased the volume of their assets, productive assets, fairly quickly, as we'll see. The second feature of Pakistan's industrial structure, as we've just indicated, was that it was highly inefficient. Because there were no pressures, no incentives to increase efficiency or hire people on the basis of merit or innovate. It was easy money. You know, these industries which were inefficient in international terms were actually earning often more than 100% profit in rupee terms at home. So this industry was, your main industry was in fact inefficient. And the third was that it was not, because it could not innovate and diversify, you ended up with an industrial structure that was not very competitive internationally. So that your capacity to earn foreign exchange was constrained by the inefficiency and narrow base of your industrial structure, the lack of diversification in your industrial structure. People who were in textiles tended to remain in textiles because they were making good money. There was no pressure on them to diversify towards high value added goods and services. Well, the consequence of these policies, as one can imagine, the strategic objective in the design of the policy was in fact achieved. The strategic objective was to increase growth on the basis of inequality. That is in fact what happened. The Ayub period was a period of, as I said, a relatively high GDP growth, in fact one of the highest in the history of Pakistan, 6.25% annually. But it was also, for understandable reasons, it was also a period of rapidly increasing interpersonal and interregional inequalities. For example, by the end of the 1960s, 22 families controlled 66% of industrial assets. And the interesting aspect of these industrialists was that there were interlocking directorates between their manufacturing industries, insurance and banking. So the same people who were sitting on the boards of directors of manufacturing enterprises were also sitting on the boards of directors of insurance companies and the very banks that were lending to these manufacturing enterprises. So it was a neat arrangement, interlocking directorates, which reinforced not only the rent-based nature of that industrial structure, but also generated high degree of concentration of industrial assets, as we've just pointed out. And now it is during precisely the high growth period of the 1960s, when assets and income was getting concentrated in a few hands, it was precisely during that period of the 1960s that the bottom 60% of the people suffered an absolute decline in their standards of living. If you look at for example, the per capita food grain consumption of the bottom 60% of the people, that actually declined during the 1960s. For example, in the urban areas, the bottom 60% of Pakistan's urban populations suffered a decline in its per capita food consumption from an index of 100 in 1963-64 to 96.1 in 1969-70. So there was an absolute decline in the per capita food grain consumption of the bottom 60% of the urban population. And that is reflective of the decline in their standards of living. I mean, if they're constricting their food consumption, you can imagine their state of affairs economically. Similarly, in the case of rural areas, actually the decline in per capita food grain consumption was even sharper. This decline in the rural areas in terms of per capita consumption of food grain was starting with an index of 100 in 1963, declined to only 91 in 1969-70. So this was with respect to interpersonal inequality in the distribution of income and assets. There was also a highly unequal growth with respect to regions. If you look, the two main regions at that time were West Pakistan and East Pakistan. And you find that most of the new industry was concentrated in West Pakistan. And the Green Revolution also affected positively West Pakistan relatively more than East Pakistan. And so you find that the growth in per capita income in West Pakistan during that period was more than twice the per capita income growth of East Pakistan. East Pakistan was growing in terms of per capita income by only 1.5% annually during that period, whereas West Pakistan's economy was growing at the rate of 3.6% annually during the period of the 1960s. So in other words, the economic strategy that was followed during the period of the 1960s of giving protection and providing rents for selected members of the industrial elite or commercial elite, by providing them a whole range of protectionist measures and subsidized credit and so on, that created an industrial structure that was inefficient, that lacked export competitiveness, and that became the basis of both interpersonal and interregional inequalities. Now, these economic consequences had both short as well as long-term adverse consequences for Pakistan. The short-term consequences obviously were that the acute inequality in the interpersonal distribution of income, the growing gap between the rich and poor, in other words, resulted in a popular movement in West Pakistan against the very political system within which that growth had taken place. At the very time when the Ayub government was celebrating its decade of reforms was also the period when large masses of people, large numbers of people were out on the street on the basis of the rich-poor divide. So the political system within which growth was taking place was overthrown as a result of interpersonal inequality. As far as interregional inequality between East and West Pakistan is concerned, that became the basis of a popular nationalist movement, a popular secessionist movement. It became a secessionist movement, unfortunately, in the latter part of the 60s, late 60s, because the people of the government of West Pakistan, the state, was not willing to incorporate the demands of the political and democratic demands of East Pakistan, of the people of East Pakistan. And so when the election was held, and the Awami League, which was very popular in East Pakistan, got the majority seats in East Pakistan, and in effect got the majority of seats in Pakistan as a whole, was deliberately excluded from forming a government in Pakistan, and the National Assembly session was prevented from being called. And so this regional economic and disparity and political exclusion of East Pakistan were key factors that agitated the people of East Pakistan and induced them to convert what was basically a movement for democratic rights, of a better deal on the economic front and a better deal on the political front. These were democratic demands that got converted into a separatist movement, and ultimately there was this terrible civil war between the state of Pakistan and East Pakistan, the people of East Pakistan, which resulted then in the emergence of independent Bangladesh at the crest of a popular independence struggle, and Pakistan lost the majority of its population in East Pakistan. Okay, so these were the devastating short-term consequences of the policy of functional inequality that was followed, which was to make the rich richer, both in terms of the richer regions as well as in terms of the richer sections of the population. The longer-term consequences, which we are still suffering, is that, as I said, a mold had been set, a particular kind of structure had been set up in industry, and a particular kind of institutional framework was created that was rent-based for the industrial elite, which induced three things. First, it induced a tendency to consume rather than save, luxury consumption. And so investment during all the high growth periods, the assumption that when the rich become richer, they'll save more, failed to take effect, was in fact proven to be invalid, because when the rich got richer, they began to consume more rather than saving, and their investment was based on cheap credit, cheap banking capital. Okay, investment was made, but then it was based on borrowed money. So the first feature of this particular kind of economy, the first structural feature, was that it became an aid-dependent economy. Whenever we were able to borrow money and use that money to lend to both the government and the entrepreneurs, we were able to have high rates of investment and high rates of growth. When that borrowed money was not easily available, our growth rates plummeted, as we have seen from that table. Okay? The second feature of this kind of economy, which was a direct consequence of the kind of economic strategy that was followed, was that it was an economy where growth was predicated on inequality, was based on inequality. So growing aid dependence and growing inequalities were the two consequences at the structural level of the policy that was followed during the Ayub period. And the third aspect of that industrial structure, of that economic structure, was that since that growth was based on inequality, or upon a small and narrow elite that was doing the investment, and that was essentially inefficient in nature, economically inefficient in nature, we could not sustain that growth rate over long periods of time. We could only grow in spurts. Our industrial structure, and indeed the agriculture, which was producing low value added goods for exports, our economy didn't have the kind of dynamic export competitiveness that would be necessary to finance through foreign exchange earnings the import requirements of high growth. That is why, as we've seen, whenever we achieved high rates of growth, we had to stop that period of high growth because we hit into a balance of payments crisis. So the three features, in summary, of that particular kind of economic structure that emerged with Ayub Khan, and which had long-term consequences and still remains with us in many ways because it hasn't been addressed by successive governments, was first that we had an inefficient economic structure. Second, it was a structure that was dependent on foreign aid. And thirdly, it had a built-in tendency for inequality. And then finally, this was an economic structure which generated unsustainable growth. We couldn't sustain that growth. Okay. So if you want to characterize very briefly the economy that emerged, the sort of economic architecture that took shape during the Ayub period, we can say it involved, firstly, the emergence of an entrepreneurial elite under state-regulated capitalism. You'd call it crony capitalism, if you like, but it was state-regulated capitalism. It was an institutional framework within which a selected elite was systematically nurtured on the basis of rents, unearned income. And therefore, they were kept inefficient. They had very few incentives for increasing efficiency, productivity, innovation, or indeed exports. The second was that we, as I said, we had an inefficient industrial structure, which was dominated by the textile industry on the basis of this rent-based framework. The third was that growth did occur, but then growth was based on inequality. And this is the case in a situation where growth is taking place within a rent-based institutional structure. This is also a growth process. It's not only unequal, but that breeds inefficiency and inequality. The fourth feature is that this economic inefficiency led to slow export growth and consequently increasing aid dependence. And finally, the inequality that this growth generated precisely made this growth unsustainable. Because as I said, if your growth is based on a narrow elite, which also happens to be inefficient, then you are unable to sustain long-term growth because you can't earn enough export earnings and you can't invest enough with a narrow elite. Okay. So it's interesting that the economic structure that emerged was aid dependent, being inefficient. It had an endemic tendency for increasing inequality. And thirdly, it had a structural characteristic of the failure to sustain long-term economic growth. It had a structural characteristic for the stop-go pattern of economic growth that you've just seen on the table and in the graph. Okay. Now, one would have thought that the lessons we've just articulated that emerge from any serious evaluation of the AU period were not, in fact, those lessons were not learned. And as I said, successive governments failed to address the structural features of Pakistan's economy that we just indicated, and failed to address the institutional framework within which that rent-based, aid-dependent, unsustainable growth was taking place. The consequence was that inequality and mass poverty continued to persist, aid dependence continued to persist, and our failure to dramatically accelerate exports continued to exist. I made an estimate here at ITU along with my research associate Nazif, and we discovered that just to indicate the inequality in interpersonal incomes, the per month income of the richest 0.1% of Pakistan's population, after it's adjusted for tax evasion, is more than 1 million rupees. So the top 0.1% of the population has a per capita monthly income of 1 million rupees. In contrast to the per capita monthly income of the bottom 60% of the people, which is only 6,000 rupees. So 60% of the people are earning only 6,000 rupees per month, whereas the top 0.1% of the people are earning 1 million rupees per month, and that is an underestimate. Okay. Recently, the UNDP has done an exercise in estimating multidimensional poverty, which I explained last time. In terms of this multidimensional poverty in Pakistan, 38.8% of the population is living below the poverty line. So almost 39% of the population is still living below the poverty line in terms of this multidimensional poverty index. That includes things like access over education and health and water, clean water and so on. And assets, quite right. Okay. Finally, to look at inter-regional inequalities. They also continue to, despite the trauma of a war in East Pakistan and the loss of the majority of your population as a result of regionally unequal economic growth, as a result of the trauma of the people of Balochistan beginning to protest and periodically going into militancy against the state, in spite of those experiences, no serious effort was made to have a regionally equitable, no serious effort was made either to have a more equitable growth in terms of interpersonal income distribution, and no serious effort was made to have a regionally equitable economic growth. And so, grave disparities between regions continue to remain. The latest evidence, for example, shows that in the multidimensional poverty in the city of Lahore in Punjab is only 4.3%. In contrast to Qila Abdullah in Balochistan, where the multidimensional poverty index is 96.9%. So 96.9% of the people in the district of Qila Abdullah are living below the poverty line, in contrast to the conditions in Lahore, where only 4.3% are living below the poverty line. So this is an indicator of the grave disparity between regions of Pakistan. along with a grave disparity between the rich and the poor. Now, this view of generating growth on the basis of inequality could easily have been revised in a drastic fashion if our policymakers had apprised themselves of the research that was being done as late as the 1990s. Because we were making this noise much earlier, but even in the late 1990s, they could have learned the lesson by just reading the literature on the subject. For example, the econometric analysis by a whole range of authors has shown that inequality has a negative effect on long-term growth. For example, Gallor and Ziera in 1993 produced a paper showing that. Alesina and Roderick in 1994 produced a paper to show that inequality has a negative effect on long-term GDP growth. Berg and others in 2012 showed that inequality has a negative effect on long-term growth. Stiglitz more recently in 2012 came up with similar conclusions, the Nobel Prize winner. By 2014, the work of Thomas Piketty overturned even the wisdom, the research conclusions of Simon Kuznets. If you remember at the beginning of the lecture, we discussed the fact that Simon Kuznets was through, he was marshalling his empirical evidence to show that the market mechanism has a built-in tendency to, while initially your inequality may be high, as growth progresses, inequality will decline through the market system. That kind of story was dubbed by the work of Thomas Piketty to be, as he put it, quote, a fairy story, unquote. And what he did was that he brought together evidence across countries for almost 140 years, between 1870 to 2010. And his data clearly showed that inequality over the long run, instead of declining, was actually increasing. And the reason was simple. What he showed was that the rate of return on capital over the long run has been around 5%, whereas the GDP growth over the long run, per capita income growth over the long run, has been not more than 3%. So the higher rate of return on capital compared to the overall GDP growth means that the share of capital in GDP will increase, and so inequality will increase. That's what his data showed. Clearly, if anything, the market mechanism, instead of having a tendency, as Stiglitz has the earlier Simon Kuznets argued, instead of the market mechanism overcoming inequality in the long run, the market mechanism in the case of Thomas Piketty's work shows that in fact the market mechanism tends to increase inequality. Okay. Based on our own experience in Pakistan and international research, econometric work, based on that, we can make a rather commonsensical conclusion for future policy making, for redesigning, fundamentally redesigning our economic policy. And that commonsensical solution is, or proposition is, that if your investment is broad-based, that is to say, if you create conditions through your institutional framework and your rules, if you give access to the middle classes and the poor over productive assets, over credit, if you give them equitable access over input and output markets, which at the moment they don't have, and if you give them high quality skilling and high quality education, through which they can not only get into high wage employment, but start enterprises of their own, through which they can innovate, then this process of investment, savings, productivity increase, and innovation will be induced by a much larger number of people than just the elite. And this broad-based nature of savings, investment, productivity increase, and innovation can fuel not only long-term growth, but that long-term growth would be based on equality rather than inequality. Okay? So the burden of my work in the last few years in my publications and so on has been to argue that we can in fact achieve a higher and more sustained economic growth through equity. So equity can be a basis, in fact, of a sustained and a higher and sustained economic growth as opposed to inequality. Okay. Now the remaining part of the lecture will go into a bit of detail, not very much, of how it is possible to design a policy framework where high and sustained growth can be achieved on the basis of greater equality. In that regard, I would suggest that you consider 5 policy initiatives in the Pakistani case, 5. The first is that we shift from the old elite farmer agriculture strategy that we have followed for the last 5 or 6 decades. We shift from an elite farmer based strategy to an agriculture growth strategy that is based on the medium and small farmers. That is to say, farmers operating less than 25 acres of land. This medium and small farmer agriculture growth strategy would be based in turn on 3 initiatives. The first is a policy of land to the tiller. Give land to the tiller. The government has about 3.6 million acres of land, probably more, I'm told, which it can distribute in 5-acre packages to people who are tenants and are operating land. They would become owners. And in so becoming owners, they would acquire both the incentive as well as the ability to invest in yield increases and contribute to agriculture growth. You see, because so long as you have a tenancy-operated system, tenant-based system, the tenants have neither the surpluses required for investment to increase productivity and growth, nor do they have the incentive, because they know that almost half the output that they produce, half their effort is going to get lost and go into the hands of the landlord. So you can create both an incentive and the ability to increase yields and growth by giving land to the tiller, at least distributing this 3.6 million acres of agricultural land in 5-acre packages. This would solve 50% of your tenancy problem. For the remaining 50% of the tenants, the idea here is that the government creates, on the basis of multilateral donors and on the funding, $4 to $4.5 billion credit fund, which it gives to those tenants who have not acquired government land. And this credit can be given to them specifically to be able to purchase land of their own. They can either purchase the land that they're currently tilling or buy land close by of their own. Okay, so a strategy of medium and small farmer agriculture growth will, in this initiative, involve firstly policy of land to the tiller. Second, you develop an institutional framework which I have called the small farmer development corporations. These would be like social enterprises. Yunus calls them social enterprises. That is to say, there will be enterprises in the private sector which are owned by the poor, by the medium and small farmers. These enterprises would be owned in the equity holdings by the poor, but they would be operated by professionals. And these corporations, small farmer development corporations, would be providing services to precisely those farmers who are poor. So these are firms that are providing services but are owned by the poor, and they're providing services to the poor. Right? What would those services include? They would include, first of all, organizing credit, accessing credit for the small and medium farmers. It would involve developing their land where there are problems of cultivation. It would involve laser leveling the land so that there is better irrigation efficiency on the farm. It would involve giving technological support and credit for drip farming. That would improve water use efficiency. It would involve introducing other new technologies such as tunnel farming so that they can grow high value added crops off season. And finally, these small farmer development corporations would provide the technologies and the know-how and the credit for these small and medium farmers to diversify their crop economy towards the non-crop sector, which is livestock and dairying. That has great potential, as I said last time, in Pakistan. You know, Pakistan is the 5th largest producer of milk, and we happen to be sitting at the hub of a crescent of milk importing countries from West Asia to Central Asia to East Asia, right? And if Pakistan could double its milk output, let's say by giving credit to these small farmers to buy more milk animals, and by improving the feed of these animals to improve their yield, we could become a major exporter of milk and related products. Similarly with livestock. Livestock is owned by even the poorest farmers. The idea here is to strengthen that particular asset of theirs, give them money for more, and to make institutional arrangements through which this can be, the cattle can be graded in terms of quality, the quality control procedures can be ensured on the consequent meat that's produced, and then it's packed, and the storage and the export. That entire supply chain could be given institutional support so that these small farmers become capable of exporting to the world market both milk and milk products and livestock, meat. These are high value added products, and it would play a strategic role not only in accelerating overall agriculture growth that would be based on greater equality, but it would also involve rapidly accelerating Pakistan's exports, right? The second initiative is what I have called, as part of this strategy of growth through equality, is what I have called participatory development, or a group of us have called participatory development. I don't know if you saw this book that we did called Participatory Development Lessons from South Asia. It's Oxford University Press and the United Nations University produced that, published it. The idea there is to organize communities at the local level. Autonomous community organizations should be made. And these community organizations would provide the organizational framework for providing skills to their members, who would be small farmers, increasing their productivity, giving them access over credit so that they can set up enterprises of their own, micro enterprises, enable them to save out of their increased income, encourage them to save out of their increased income, and thereby begin a localized process of what I've called a localized process of capital accumulation and economic growth, which is generated by the improved ability and incomes of income capabilities of the poor in the rural areas. This can also happen in the urban areas, but this is mainly about rural areas. The third initiative is to achieve rapid growth of small and medium manufacturing enterprises. Now, if you think about it, see, Pakistan has a great potential for skill. We are a highly talented people. And this could be because, we have been the crucible of many civilizations, many urban civilizations. We've been an urban civilization for almost 7,000 years, right? And therefore, we have great capacity to innovate and talent and to think outside the box and to learn skills very rapidly. Now, I have seen that with my own eyes. I've done surveys of these small manufacturing enterprises, these workshops, all across Hazara and various other places in Multan. And what I discovered was that these people were, the Germans at one point in time gave them technical support. They got these technicians, high quality trainer of trainers, and gave them high quality equipment which they put onto a trawler, and they took this deep into the backward areas and invited young people who had workshops to upgrade their skills. And they were shocked to find that within that 2-week period of the course, these very people who were registered for the course were able to produce very high precision calibrating instruments. And when I went to interview these people in the Haripur area, they had this, inevitably each of them had this very sophisticated kind of measuring instrument on the window scale. And when I asked them, are you producing this now? They said, no, we're not producing this. They continue to produce low value added items such as taps and window shutters and car exhaust pipes and so on. Now, the idea in the case of accelerating the growth of such people is that precisely because they're poor, they don't have adequate credit to shift to buy or even hire equipment to produce high value added goods. They don't have access over large scale industry which can give them outsourcing contracts. And so what is required is to set up what we've called common facilities centers. In each growth node, and we specified those, where you have a cluster of these workshops, you set up a common facilities center. Now that center can be initiated through a public-private partnership, but the small workshop owners can be shareholders in that also. And what it would do is it would provide 4 services which I have judged from my survey are the structural constraints to accelerating the growth of the small scale enterprises, manufacturing enterprise. The first is to provide them with forging facility, high quality forging facility. No one small unit can afford a forging facility. So you provide a forging facility at the common facilities center, and these small manufacturers, once they have a contract to produce those items, can come and rent out those facilities in the forging center, in the common facilities center. Second, to achieve greater dimensional control in the high quality products, you need surface treatment and heat treatment facilities. Those facilities too can be provided in the common facilities centers. The third is giving them an institutional support, an institutional link up with large scale manufacturing industry which could outsource some of their components of their motor cars or whatever else they're producing to these small workshops. And finally, these workshops could be provided training in quality control. they can produce one or two items very well, but if you give them a relatively largish order, they have a problem, a management problem with quality control. So there are standard management procedures for quality control, ISO 9001 or whatever. You can train them to do that, so that these people would have the necessary management and technical skills, as well as the technical facilities, to be able to produce high value added items on contract from the large scale manufacturing sector. So that's the third initiative. The fourth, something that we've ignored for a long time, is to have a universal provision of high quality healthcare, high quality education, and social protection. By social protection, I mean unemployment benefits by the state and state pensions at the end of your career. After all, every person is a taxpayer, either directly or indirectly. You are paying either direct taxes or indirect taxes. You're taxpayers. The government has should have an obligation of giving them state pensions at the end of their professional career when they're old. Now, the idea here is that every citizen of Pakistan, as a matter of right, should have government provided high quality health, high quality education, and social protection. You see, a number of countries in both the developing and the developed world who achieved long-term sustained economic growth have actually been able to do so on the basis of this universal provision of these three services: health, education, and social security. If you look at Germany under Bismarck in the late 19th century, they gave this commitment in the late 19th century. Meiji Japan in the middle of the 20th century gave this commitment. The Scandinavian countries in the early 20th century. China in the middle of the 20th century. Similarly, Brazil and Chile. All these countries, it has been argued, one of the key factors in their long-term growth and development was the universal provision of these basic services that we just mentioned: health, education, and social security. Now, the question that has been asked from me is, where do we get the money from? And my answer is that we have now new data to show that each of the countries I've mentioned, whether it's Bismarck's Germany in the late 19th century or Meiji Dynasty Japan in the middle of the 20th century, or China in the middle of the 20th century, or Brazil or Chile, each of these countries, at the time that they made the commitment for the universal provision of these services, had a per capita income that was lower than the per capita income of Pakistan today. So it's not a question of not being able to afford them. We can't afford not to give these services to our people. See, consider, in a sense, it's commonsensical, although now new research establishes that commonsensical thing. What is commonsensical is that if you provide better health, if you develop healthy citizens, you see, for example, the survey we did for the UNDP showed that 65% of the people we interviewed were sick at the time of the interview in 10 districts. These are poor communities. And they had been ill for almost 3 months on average in the year. Now, if you're able to provide better health care to your population, and you're able to give them better skills and education, then naturally their productivity will rise. A healthy and skilled and educated population will increase your productivity and contribute to growth that way. So the provision of these services is not a social sector thing that is marginal to growth. It's central to the growth process itself, having a healthy and productive population, right? Okay. Quite apart from that, So not only is there a direct effect of providing these services on long-term growth, there's also an indirect effect. And that indirect effect comes via achieving greater social cohesion. So you see, if you give free healthcare, free education, social protection to all citizens, they develop a stake in that system. That induces greater social cohesion. And as the work of Easterly has shown, that greater social cohesion is a key factor in long-term economic growth. Similarly, better education can become the basis of a broader base for innovation. And as Professor Aghion has shown in his work at Harvard, that the greater the depth and range of innovations, the higher is the long-term growth. And by educating and developing a healthy population that's committed to the country, you will be creating the basis of innovations for long-term economic growth. Okay, finally, this brings us to the question of building a knowledge infrastructure. As I said, one of the key factors in Pakistan's failure to achieve sustained economic growth is that our export growth is insufficient to finance the import requirements of high growth. Got it? Yeah, every time we've achieved high growth, import expenditures go up, exports are not enough, so we hit into a balance of payment crisis, and down comes the growth subsequently. Well, the reason why, the structural reason why our export growth is insufficient is that we have not been able to diversify into high value added knowledge intensive goods. Now, to be able to do that, the thing about the knowledge intensive high value added goods is that these exports, high value added knowledge intensive exports, are occupying a larger and larger proportion of global export demand. As global income rises, people are spending a larger and larger proportion of their income on high value added knowledge intensive goods and services, right? Okay, now to be able to diversify towards this high value added knowledge intensive sectors, you need an infrastructure of knowledge, a knowledge infrastructure. You have to be able to do cutting edge research. You have to have a whole section of the population that's not only educated, but has the capacity for critical thinking, which is key to producing new ideas and innovation. Right? So what we need to do is to build world-class universities and to have training of people to think in an original fashion. Right? Only then can you make a contribution, a genuine contribution to global knowledge and innovate, and only then can you have that knowledge infrastructure which would power export diversification towards the kind of products we've talked about. Okay. So strangely enough, building universities of a world-class character is a key step towards changing the pattern of our growth from the spurt-based stop-go pattern to sustained economic growth. Build a knowledge infrastructure. But building a knowledge infrastructure is not just about building an economy. It's about building a civilization, enhancing our civilization. Because as we've discussed during the course of our lectures, one of the key constraints to a policy of sustainable development, protecting the environment, and caring for the poor in terms of reducing inequality and poverty is lack of compassion. We need to develop in the new generation a capacity for compassion. It's a natural human ability that has been lying dormant for almost 3 centuries. And education, in the real sense of the term, means, the Latin for it is educare, which means bringing to the surface that which is dormant in us. And what is dormant in us is precisely this compassion, this loving kindness, right? So your new world-class universities would be doing three kinds of things. The first is building a new kind of sensibility as the basis of a new kind of more humane public policy. It would be building not only compassion for the economy and the civilization, it would be equipping students for critical thinking, which is the basis of innovation and the creation of knowledge creation or research. And the third thing it would do, this knowledge infrastructure, is to provide the basis for the intellectual basis for democracy, because if you have these people with the capacity to do critical thinking, when they participate in public policy issues, or whether they're related with politics or with economics, you'll have a broad basis of reasoned discussion through which you can develop your democracy. So both the economic, the political, and the social dimensions of the country require the building of a knowledge infrastructure. As I said, I'll conclude here. The knowledge infrastructure would essentially involve research institutes and world-class universities, which A, enable students to rediscover their sense of compassion, B, develop the ability for critical thinking and the capacity for making original contributions to knowledge, C, acquire cutting-edge computer-based quantitative skills. You need quantitative skills. You need an understanding of big data techniques, which you're going to be taught in this particular degree course. Those are just as important as understanding the relationships between things and synthesizing things. They're critical features in analysis using quantitative skills. And they drive contemporary public policy in terms of providing the basis of an evidence-based public policy. You use evidence based on mass data to design policy. So all three of these skills, developing the sensibility of compassion, developing the capacity for critical thinking, and acquiring the technical skills, which are computer-based quantitative skills, for building a whole new generation that would power this country into a new trajectory where it would not only have sustained economic growth based on equality, but it would be making a contribution to the world in terms of civilization. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.